Chicago, 1982. The city was buzzing like any other major American city in the early 80s. Life was fast, loud, and alive. Families went about their routines. Kids rushed to school, parents hustled to work, and sitting quietly on almost every kitchen counter, every bathroom shelf, every bedside drawer was a small white bottle, Tylenol, the pain reliever trusted by millions, a household staple. Nobody questioned it, nobody feared it, until one ordinary September morning, when that little white bottle became a weapon of mass terror. On September 29, 1982, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman woke up not feeling well. It was just a normal sickness, nothing unusual. Her parents, like any caring parents, reached for the medicine cabinet. They handed her a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol, the same pill millions of Americans swallowed every day without a second thought. Within hours, Mary was dead, just 12 years old, gone. At first, no one connected it to Tylenol. How could they? Kids get sick. Kids sometimes die. Tragic, but not unheard of. But Chicago had no idea what was coming next. Later that same day, in a nearby suburb, another tragedy struck. Adam Janus, a 27-year-old postal worker, wasn't feeling well. He, too, reached for Tylenol. Within hours, Adam collapsed. Doctors initially thought it was a massive heart attack, but Adam wasn't the only one who would die that day. His brother Stanley and Stanley's wife Teresa rushed to the hospital to comfort the grieving family. Heartbroken, exhausted, and in shock, they returned to Adam's home to mourn. But grief turned into horror when they, too, developed sudden symptoms after taking Tylenol from the same bottle Adam had used. Both collapsed. Both died. Now the authorities started to notice a pattern. In less than 24 hours, 3 members of the same family were dead. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And it didn't stop there. More victims soon followed. Mary McFarland, a young mother from Elmhurst. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant. Mary Reiner, who had just given birth to her 4th child. All healthy, all dead within hours. The common link, every single one had swallowed Tylenol capsules. Panic spread like wildfire. What was happening? How could an over-the-counter painkiller suddenly kill people? Investigators soon uncovered the horrifying truth. Someone had tampered with Tylenol bottles. Inside, instead of relief, were capsules laced with potassium cyanide, a deadly poison that kills in minutes. A single grain was enough to drop someone to the floor, and these bottles weren't isolated. They had made their way into stores, into homes, into the very heart of American life. The nightmare was only beginning. That evening, police cars roared through neighborhoods with loudspeakers blaring, "Stop taking Tylenol immediately. Destroy any bottles you have. Do not take Tylenol." Helicopters flew above suburban streets. News anchors delivered breaking reports. Families gathered around TV sets, terrified. That familiar white bottle, sitting in every kitchen and bathroom, suddenly looked like a ticking time bomb. Johnson & Johnson, the company behind Tylenol, was blindsided. Their best-selling product, the #1 painkiller in America, was now a killer. The company faced a nightmare scenario. 7 people dead in Chicago, a city spiraling into panic, and an entire nation demanding answers. Was it sabotage? Was it terrorism? Was it a deranged serial killer? Nobody knew, and that uncertainty was worse than anything. Because every bottle looked the same, every capsule looked normal, and anyone, anywhere, could be next. The morning after the first deaths, Chicago was already drowning in fear. Hospitals were on high alert. Newsrooms scrambled for updates, and in every store across the suburbs, clerks rushed to pull Tylenol bottles from the shelves. But it was too late. Millions of bottles had already been sold across the country. The police quickly realized this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a faulty product line. It was deliberate. Someone had taken bottles of Tylenol, opened them, filled the capsules with potassium cyanide, and then returned them to store shelves. The randomness was terrifying. This wasn't a targeted attack on a single family. It was chaos, planted right into everyday life. The FBI joined the case almost immediately. Agents swarmed drugstores, warehouses and distribution centers, searching for tampered bottles. Helicopters hovered over Chicago, carrying officials and evidence. A task force was assembled. The FBI, local police, medical examiners, and Johnson & Johnson themselves. Their mission: stop the deaths before the entire country spiraled into hysteria. The media, however, was already stoking the flames. Headlines screamed, "Tylenol kills." Evening broadcasts showed footage of victims' grieving families. Talk shows speculated on motives. Was it a terrorist act, a personal vendetta against Johnson & Johnson, or the work of a deranged serial killer? America was hooked on fear, and the killer had achieved something terrifying. He had turned a nation's medicine cabinet into a weapon. Meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson executives scrambled in their New Jersey headquarters. Tylenol was their crown jewel, accounting for a huge share of their profits. But profits suddenly didn't matter. The company's reputation, built on trust and reliability, was crumbling in real time. The question hanging over every meeting was brutal. How do you convince Americans to trust Tylenol again, when Tylenol is what's killing them? Within 48 hours, Johnson & Johnson made a decision that shocked everyone. Instead of denying responsibility or minimizing the issue, they ordered a nationwide recall of every single bottle of Tylenol. 31 million bottles, worth over $100 million, pulled from shelves, destroyed. No hesitation. For a corporate giant, it was an unprecedented move, but they knew it was the only way. The company even set up toll-free hotlines for worried customers, and offered to exchange Tylenol capsules for tablets, which were safer. Still, the deaths continued to haunt Chicago. At least 7 confirmed victims, with dozens more suspected. Families mourned. Funeral processions stretched through quiet neighborhoods, and investigators worked around the clock to catch whoever was behind the murders. The FBI began analyzing the tampered capsules. Forensics confirmed they were laced with lethal doses of cyanide, thousands of times more powerful than needed to kill. Whoever did this wasn't just experimenting. They wanted maximum destruction. But here was the problem. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance cameras, no witnesses. The tampering could have happened at any point. At the factory, at a warehouse, on the store shelf. Investigators had no idea where to even begin. To make things worse, the killer seemed to vanish into thin air. No ransom notes, no threats, no manifesto, just death, dropped randomly into suburban homes. This was terrorism without a message, a faceless phantom with no demands. But then, investigators got a break, or so they thought. A man named James William Lewis sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson. In it he demanded $1 million to stop the killings. The letter was traced back to him, and Lewis was arrested. For a brief moment, the nation thought the nightmare was over, but the evidence didn't match. Lewis had a history of fraud and extortion, but he had no access to Tylenol's supply chain. There was no proof he had tampered with the bottles. He went to prison for extortion, but the actual Tylenol killer, still out there. By now, fear had spread nationwide. Households everywhere dumped Tylenol bottles into the trash. Some families burned them, others returned them to pharmacies demanding refunds. Supermarkets were ghost towns in the medicine aisles. People looked at their pills with suspicion, not relief. Johnson & Johnson was forced to reinvent everything about how medicine was sold in America. In a matter of weeks, they introduced tamper-proof packaging, foil seals, child-proof caps and plastic wrapping that made it nearly impossible to open a bottle without leaving evidence. It seems normal now, but back then, this was revolutionary. The Tylenol murders changed how the entire pharmaceutical industry operated. But even as safety measures improved, one question lingered: who did it, and why? Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed it was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Others thought it was a terrorist testing how quickly they could cripple America with fear. There were whispers of a copycat killer, but nothing ever stuck. And in the middle of all this, Chicago lived in paranoia. Parents checked every pill their children took. People drove across town just to buy a different brand of medicine. The once simple act of swallowing a Tylenol capsule had become a roll of the dice with death. The Tylenol Killer had disappeared, but his shadow remained, and investigators feared he could strike again, anywhere, at any time. Weeks turned into months, and Chicago tried to return to normal. But the Tylenol murders had left scars. Parents still second-guessed every medicine bottle. Pharmacies enforced new safety checks, and the shadow of the killer hung over every household. The FBI's task force pushed forward. Agents interviewed employees at Johnson & Johnson, distribution center workers and retail staff. They searched for anyone with access to the supply chain, but they kept hitting dead ends. The tampering seemed too random. It didn't trace back to the factory. It didn't trace back to one specific store. Whoever did this had moved through everyday life like a ghost, slipping bottles off shelves, poisoning them, then putting them back without leaving a trace. And yet, investigators knew one thing for sure. This was no amateur. The killer had access to cyanide. Not the kind you buy at a hardware store, but lab-grade industrial cyanide. Whoever they were, they had knowledge, patience and nerves of steel. But while the FBI was stumped, the public was restless. Every few weeks there were new scares. Reports poured in from around the country. Suspicious capsules found. Another death linked to Tylenol. Most turned out to be false alarms or unrelated, but each headline reignited the panic. Copycats also began to emerge. Just months after Chicago's tragedy, similar poisonings appeared in New York, California, and Texas. Pills laced with rat poison, bottles with strange smells, threatening letters mailed to pharmaceutical companies. Some cases were hoaxes, others real. The Tylenol murders had opened Pandora's box, showing the world how easy it was to turn over-the-counter medicine into a weapon. Johnson & Johnson faced another uphill battle. Their recall and tamper-proof packaging were praised as revolutionary, but the brand still carried a stain. Parents whispered at playgrounds. Doctors reassured patients, but the fear remained. Trust was shattered. And in America, once trust is gone, it rarely comes back fully. Meanwhile, investigators thought back to James William Lewis, the man who wrote the extortion letter. He was serving time for trying to exploit the murders, but could he have been the killer all along? He lived in New York at the time of the poisonings, but his wife had family in Chicago. He was smart enough to carry out the crime, and his history of scams and fraud showed he had no conscience. Still, prosecutors never found the smoking gun. Without physical evidence, they couldn't charge him. Other suspects appeared over the years: disgruntled workers, angry spouses, even rumors of foreign sabotage. Each was investigated, and each came up empty. The Tylenol Killer seemed to vanish after 1982, leaving behind no trail, no new victims, and no closure. By the late 1980s, the murders had become more than just a cold case. They had become a turning point in American culture. New laws were passed, making it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. Packaging in every industry, from food to cosmetics, shifted overnight. Seals, shrink wraps, and safety warnings became the norm. The Tylenol murders didn't just change medicine, they changed trust itself. Still, the mystery refused to die. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, journalists, criminologists, and amateur sleuths kept returning to the case. Books were written, TV specials aired, documentaries probed every theory. Some believed the killer had bragged about it to friends, and was never caught. Others thought he had struck once, achieved maximum fear, and then stopped forever. The case also became a dark blueprint. Future poisoners and terrorists studied it. Every time another contamination scare happened, Whether it was poisoned Halloween candy or tainted bottled water, the Tylenol murders were mentioned. The killer, whoever he was, had achieved a horrifying kind of immortality. But perhaps the cruelest twist was this: the victims themselves often got overshadowed by the story. The 7 who died in Chicago, Mary Kellerman, Adam Janis and 5 others, were real people. Children, parents, siblings. Their deaths were sudden, violent and senseless. Families were torn apart, and decades later, those families still live with the weight of unanswered questions. Why them? Why Chicago? Why Tylenol? 40 years later, no one has those answers. The FBI has kept files open. Johnson & Johnson still cooperates with investigators. Journalists still chase leads. But the truth is, the Tylenol killer may never be caught. He or she may have died years ago carrying their secret to the grave. And yet, every time you open a sealed bottle of medicine, you are touching the legacy of the Tylenol murders. The foil seal, the plastic wrap, the child-proof cap, all born from one unsolved tragedy. The case is more than just a crime story. It's a reminder of how fragile trust is, how quickly safety can be shattered, and how one faceless person, with a handful of cyanide, forced an entire nation to change. By the time October 1st, 1982 dawned, Chicago was no longer the same city it had been 2 days before. Overnight, an ordinary bottle of pain relievers had become a symbol of terror. Pharmacies across Cook County were raided by police, shelves stripped bare of Tylenol, and radio stations blasted warnings every 30 minutes. Do not use Tylenol. Dispose of it immediately. The streets carried an invisible dread. A routine trip to the drugstore, something every household did without thought, now felt like Russian roulette. The victims' funerals only deepened the sense of unease. Adam Janis's wake turned into a grotesque reminder of the tragedy, when 2 coffins belonging to his wife's grieving family were placed beside his, a single family struck by a product meant to heal. What could be more senseless? Reporters swarmed the churchyard, cameras capturing every tear-streaked face. The city's pain was now a national headline. America was watching Chicago with horror. Behind the scenes, the investigation was spiraling in complexity. Detectives tried to trace the cyanide to its source. Who had slipped the poison into the capsules? Was it an inside job at Johnson & Johnson, or a random lunatic? The logistics were baffling. Each tampered bottle contained only a handful of poisoned capsules, not the entire batch. That meant someone had physically opened the packaging, swapped out capsules with cyanide-laced ones, then carefully resealed them, returning the bottles to store shelves without drawing suspicion. This wasn't an accident. It was calculated, deliberate murder, and the randomness of it all made the act even more terrifying. Fear quickly spread beyond Chicago. Within days, reports of similar deaths trickled in from other states, though most turned out to be false alarms. Still, the paranoia had already infected the public psyche. People across America poured their Tylenol bottles into toilets, flushed capsules down drains, or left them outside in sealed bags for hazmat crews to collect. The once trusted brand was now synonymous with death. Pharmacies saw sales of other pain relievers skyrocket, while Tylenol sat untouched, gathering dust, a symbol of betrayal. The FBI joined the investigation, classifying it as a case of product tampering, a relatively new legal category that had barely been tested in court. They interviewed store clerks, factory workers, delivery drivers, anyone with a conceivable link to the poisoned bottles. Yet the evidence was almost non-existent. Whoever had done this had left behind no fingerprints, no fibers, no witnesses, just the cold efficiency of cyanide. Meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson faced the greatest corporate crisis of its history. Tylenol was its most profitable product, controlling over a third of the painkiller market. Within days, that empire was in ruins. Share prices plummeted. Company executives gathered in tense boardrooms, debating whether the brand could survive. Some argued for quiet damage control, others pushed for transparency.
CEO James Burke made a radical decision. The company would recall every bottle of Tylenol in America. Over 31 million bottles were pulled from shelves, costing Johnson & Johnson more than $100 million. It was a gamble, an admission of danger, but also a move that showed the public the company valued lives over profit. At the same time, the FBI received a chilling letter. It claimed responsibility for the poisonings and demanded $1 million to stop the killing. The letter was traced to a man named James William Lewis, living in New York, but investigators quickly realized something was off. Lewis had a history of fraud and extortion, but no evidence connected him to the actual poisonings. He became the prime suspect, but without physical proof, prosecutors could only convict him of extortion. He served over a decade in prison, yet the central mystery remained: was he really the axeman of Tylenol, or just a con artist capitalizing on mass panic? Back in Chicago, families continued to grieve. The victims weren't celebrities, weren't part of some crime syndicate. They were school children, postal workers, homemakers, people who trusted a simple red and white capsule to take away their pain. Their stories turned into cautionary tales, whispered across neighborhoods. Mothers checked medicine cabinets obsessively, fathers read labels with suspicion, and children were warned never to touch pills without asking first. The murders also changed how America viewed safety. Suddenly, the concept of tamper-evident packaging became a national priority. Before 1982, medicine bottles could be opened and closed without any visible sign of interference. After Tylenol, that era ended. Johnson & Johnson pioneered triple seal technology, foil seals, child-proof caps, and plastic wrap that cracked if removed. The FDA soon mandated such packaging across the entire pharmaceutical industry. It was a revolution born of tragedy, a shift that touched every household in America. But for the families of the 7 who died, packaging laws were small comfort. They wanted justice. Detectives scoured leads for years, reopening the case whenever new evidence surfaced. They chased rumors of disgruntled employees, copycat poisoners, even whispers of domestic terrorism. But every trail went cold. The Tylenol murders remained a ghost case, a story retold in classrooms and criminology lectures but never resolved. Yet the cultural impact lingered. Halloween candy was suddenly feared as a potential poison source. Though most cases turned out to be urban legends, parents no longer trusted anything unsealed. Check your candy became an annual ritual. Supermarket shoppers squeezed packaging, shook bottles, anything to reassure themselves that what they were buying hadn't been tampered with. The shadow of Tylenol stretched far beyond Chicago. It reshaped American paranoia, and through it all, the victims' names were remembered, repeated like an unfinished prayer. Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary Reiner, Paula Prince, Mary McFarland. Ordinary people who became unwilling martyrs in a story that exposed the fragility of trust in modern life. By the end of 1982, Johnson & Johnson had begun a massive rebranding campaign, offering free Tylenol to anyone willing to try the newly sealed bottles. Slowly the public returned. Within a year, Tylenol regained its spot as the top-selling painkiller. The company was praised for its transparency and consumer-first response. It became a case study in crisis management. But beneath the corporate success story, the killer was still free. No conviction, no closure, just an empty file marked unsolved. And that perhaps is what makes the Tylenol murders so haunting. Not just the suddenness of the deaths, or the randomness of the victims, but the fact that 40 years later, the crime remains unsolved. An invisible hand reached into American households, twisted open a bottle cap, and forever changed how the country trusted the products it consumed. The funerals that followed were heartbreaking. Families mourning loved ones had no real answers, only the terrifying knowledge that a simple over-the-counter pill had turned into a weapon. In a city like Chicago, where Tylenol was in nearly every medicine cabinet, fear was spreading faster than any virus. Supermarkets, pharmacies, and corner stores pulled Tylenol bottles from their shelves. People rushed home to throw theirs away. News anchors told viewers, "Do not take Tylenol." For many, that warning carried the weight of a death sentence for one of the most trusted brands in America. The Johnson & Johnson company, which owned Tylenol, was thrown into crisis. In an era before social media, the spread of panic was powered by radio, television, and newspaper headlines. Each new report of another victim deepened the nightmare. By early October, 7 people had died. Investigators determined that the capsules had been laced with cyanide after leaving the factory, meaning the killer had gone into stores, tampered with the bottles, and returned them to the shelves. That realization shook the country. It wasn't a product defect. It was deliberate murder. The Food and Drug Administration and law enforcement scrambled to control the chaos. Police scoured store aisles inspecting bottles. Helicopters hovered over warehouses. Investigators in hazmat suits tested capsules in labs. Every tip was followed. Every suspicious character questioned. Yet the killer remained invisible. There were no fingerprints on the bottles. No cameras in the stores. No witnesses who saw the tampering. The precision of the act suggested someone who knew chemistry, and someone willing to gamble with mass terror. At Johnson & Johnson's headquarters, executives faced a nightmare decision. Should they pull the product nationwide? That meant billions in losses and possibly the end of the brand. But doing nothing risked more lives. CEO James Burke made the call. Every bottle of Tylenol in America was recalled. 31 million bottles vanished from shelves. It was the largest product recall in history at the time. Chicago turned into a city of suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another. Shoppers wondered if their medicine cabinet was a trap. Pharmacies stood half empty, shelves stripped bare. Doctors warned patients against capsules of any kind. Parents locked their medicine cabinets. In some homes, people began to pour out their pills into the sink, as if they were dumping poison. The everyday act of swallowing a pill had become an act of fear. What investigators did have, however, was one strange lead. A chilling letter sent to Johnson & Johnson. The writer claimed responsibility for the killings and demanded a ransom of $1 million to stop the poisonings. It seemed like a breakthrough, but handwriting analysis and follow-ups led nowhere. Another suspect, a man named James Lewis, was later convicted of extortion related to the letter, but never linked definitively to the actual murders. That would become the frustrating pattern of the case. Leads that looked promising but dissolved into dead ends. Even stranger were the ripples that followed. Copycat crimes began to appear. Other bottles in other states were found tampered with. Panic spread nationwide, and suddenly, every parent, every patient, every consumer was suspicious of the pills in their homes. The Tylenol murders had opened a door that could never fully be shut. The investigation ballooned. Hundreds of detectives, FBI agents and scientists worked the case. They traced distribution lines, studied chemical suppliers and tested thousands of capsules. Still, nothing. The murders were perfect in their invisibility. No one saw the poisoner. No one heard them. The crime left no scene, only bodies, and the randomness made it worse. Victims were young and old, male and female, rich and working class. Anyone could be next. The longer the case dragged on, the more people realized that the killer might never be caught. Chicago lived in paranoia. The rest of the country watched in disbelief. Safety, the kind that Americans had once taken for granted in their everyday products, was shattered. And even though Johnson & Johnson's bold recall and new tamper-proof packaging eventually rebuilt consumer trust, the murders themselves remained an open wound in the history of American true crime. The Tylenol Killer had taken 7 lives, destroyed public faith, and forever changed the way America packaged and consumed medicine. Yet the identity of that person, the shadow who walked into stores, opened bottles, slipped in cyanide, and walked away unseen, remains unknown. The city waited, investigators worked, but no justice came, only fear, memory, and a mystery that continues to haunt us to this day.